So thank you everyone for joining. Just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. We've switched off cameras and mics just to make sure we can focus on the presentation. The chat is open and we will be taking questions. So if you do have any during the course of the session, please do post them, and then we will get round to answering them perhaps towards the end of the talk. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tony, and I lead our account management and customer success teams here at Cambridge Spark. What that means is I spend most of my time speaking to senior leaders and CDOs at our clients, helping them to work out how they can solve their biggest needs when it comes to data, digital, and AI skills. But enough about me. I'm really excited to introduce our special guest today, who's a bit of a data guru. So to give you a little bit of background, after completing a degree at Cambridge University, he went on to hold the position of editor at industry publication Data Strategy. He then founded the UK's leading portal for data, the Data Governance Forum, and then went on to be the editor at the IDM Journal of Direct Data and Digital Marketing Practice, before joining DataIQ at launch as editor, and has been with them for 12 years. Not only that, he recently published his first book, Becoming Data-literate, which is available on Amazon. So ladies and gentlemen, DataIQ's Chief Knowledge Officer, David Reed. Hi, David.
Hi, Tony. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and talk to you today. Yes, I have written a book about data literacy, which might have something to do with the invitation. Let's take a look at what I'm going to talk about. Just for a bit of background, that book was based on a huge sort of evidence base that DataIQ had built since it launched in April 2011. Lots of interactions with senior data leaders via our conferences, interviews, and workshops, as well as the well-known things that we do, like our DataIQ 100 and the awards, and also the membership side of the business, where we're helping to connect, develop, and elevate those leaders. So what I'm going to talk through today hopefully reflects genuine in-the-field experience, actions, and challenges that organizations are facing, and will help you to position your own strategies and plans. So let's get into it. It's always a good thing to begin by the first principles, by defining what we're actually talking about. And as I run through this section, I think hopefully I'll make it clear that data literacy is potentially a broader domain than is sometimes considered. And that's both a positive thing, but also throws up some challenges, which we'll look at a bit later on. And the reason we talk about data literacy so extensively at DataIQ and here on this webinar and out in the industry is the last decade has seen a tremendous amount of investment into data and analytics resourcing, the establishing of data functions, data offices, the investment into people, and the technologies to support them. And when we researched that across our community, this was the sort of level of adoption that we were seeing. Now, these are people who are engaged with DataIQ, and perhaps not surprising that 21% describe their level of maturity as advanced. That's probably still a little ahead of the general UK PLC, because this was a UK base that we were asking the question of. But 21% saying they're advanced, 22% reaching maturity, and the largest group in that developing stage. So on the journey, they've begun, but there's still quite a lot in plan and still to do. A good picture, and obviously important for understanding the momentum that we've seen behind data analytics during the last decade. But when we asked about the level of data literacy, just before I answer that, I'd say there's a hand up. If you do have a question, could you just stick it in the chat and then we can read it, because we've got your cameras and mics off, so it's not necessarily easy to bring you in to asking that question. When we asked what the opinion was of the same group about the level of data literacy across their organization, we got this very striking finding, which is a really important gap between that level of adoption that's being seen and invested in to drive maturity compared to the literacy. And you can see for the advanced group, just how big that gap is. We're effectively seeing, I would say, literacy at the point where we did this survey in 2021, probably 2 to 3 years behind the actual embedding of the processes and the technology. And that's why we brought it into focus and decided that we needed to talk about it and help to drive it forward. So out of that research and that writing the book and discussions with the industry, it became evident that to claim to be data literate, you have to be able to state with confidence these 5 things, because they are the dimensions that demonstrate that you are getting towards that advanced stage of data literacy. The first one, we know the value of data. We have the data that we need. We use the data that we have. We trust the data that we have, and that we share a common data culture. Now, let me just unpack what those mean in practice a little bit. So knowing the value of data, it's not necessarily about putting a monetary value on the data asset, because we've seen just how difficult that is. But it is about being able to demonstrate that the investment into data is creating value for the business. That might be in terms of cost savings, it might be incremental revenue gains, but it's certainly about it having a value in the way the business operates. And apologies for my dog getting a little lively in the background. If you can hear that, he's 1 floor below me. I'd have to leave the webinar to quieten him, so I do apologize. So the value of data is that it's part of the business strategy. It's supporting and driving that. So secondly, do you actually have the data that you need? Most organizations now have some level of dependency on data to support business processes and creating a data ecosystem to underpin that, which certainly needs to be governed and mastered. And if you can say yes to all those things, then great, you're in the opportunity, you have the opportunity to say, we have the data we need. And I will, these slides will be available for people who want them afterwards. I suspect, Tony, that your team will help to distribute them. Getting a nod there, that's great. So not just building a data asset, but actually using it. It's one thing to collect data, but it really should be for a purpose. Most importantly, that's around the decision-making that happens, and then the democratization of the data out into departments and functions, so they can make their own reports, insights, and use of it. And also this creation of replicable data products. That's actually quite an advanced level of data usage that we see a lot of organizations migrating towards. And of course, back when everyone was worrying about GDPR or now the Data Protection Act, it is a principle that you should only be collecting data that you're actually going to make use of, not just because it might seem nice to have or you intend some future usage. So there is a governance aspect to using data that you collect. Then data trust. This really matters if you're leading the data office and you're trying to drive data literacy, because you don't want those questions in meetings of where did that number come from? Why is it not the same as the one I used to see? It's not the number I like, or that we want to report on elsewhere. Once you get to be trusted as an advisor and a credible guardian of data, those questions go away, and data trust is a really valuable commodity to create on the basis of the first 3 elements of this credo. And then finally, has that created a common data culture where data is across all of the ways of working, that the skills are in place, and this is where Tony and Cambridge Spark have a huge role to play. And do you have that shared language in how you're communicating about data? So the reason why I developed that credo is you'll probably have seen this definition of data literacy out there in the market about the ability to read, understand, create, and communicate data as information, which is a good definition, but it's also a definition that really maps against literacy generally, or even numeracy generally. It doesn't necessarily reach into what could be transformational about data and the role of data literacy within an organization. because whilst it focuses on the numeracy, the hard skills, the soft skills, those very, very important things that you have to address, there are some elements that this definition doesn't actually embrace. And that includes the working practice, but also that governance and ethics that I talked about, and then rolling up towards the evidence-based decision making. So we at DataIQ prefer to look at it this way and embrace that sense of the mindset and the behaviors, which still have threaded through them the same critical hard skills and soft skills, but also just bring into play those other dimensions that are really going to ensure that an organization is moving towards being data driven and can claim that it's progressing up to that mature and advanced level of data literacy. Now, why is this important? Well, this is a real world example some of you might have come across that unfortunately reflects the problem that if you don't have a shared language, if you don't have a shared data asset and agreed metrics, you end up wasting hundreds of millions of dollars on a project because your Mars rover, your Mars explorer, bounces off the atmosphere or burns up. No one actually knows for sure what happened. And it was because NASA uses metric and Lockheed Martin was using imperial centimeters versus inches when you're trying to bring something down through the atmosphere tends to cause a few problems. Hence, just having data is not the same as making sense of the world unless you have that commonality of culture. So I'm just going to stop there for a moment and check in. I'll go back to that one. Check in with Tony. Tony, when you're working with your clients and you are looking to drive those skills, how often do you see that sort of umbrella view of it is part of a data literacy play?
I think it varies by clients, and I thought it was really interesting seeing that graph you showed, because there's clearly a bit of a lag between how an organization is moving and adopting data analytics and how it starts to build a culture of, or mindset even, of data literacy and data fluency. So yeah, I'd say this is probably quite accurate in terms of the spread. Again, like DataIQ, the organizations we're working with are probably a bit more the forward thinking end. But then I was going to ask David, have you noticed much of a trend in terms of how that graph has looked over time?
Well, interestingly, I think there's actually probably been a softening in the figures, a slight move down that graph. And I think that's partly as you step into the levels of reaching maturity and becoming advanced in your adoption, you start to recognize more challenges and more cultural challenges and change management issues. And that's when you realize, well, whilst we may have advanced pockets and expertise in certain areas and really strong progression, there can be a lot that's untouched and can start to become a bit of an obstacle. So I can't also overlook the years of lockdown and the rise of remote working and hybrid working did have a bit of an effect, because it created a little bit more of sort of silos in how people engage and interact. And it's a little bit harder to champion some of the things that we see as best practice in this space. I don't know if you maybe were coming out of that, but I don't know if you saw that as a consequence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I guess what I'm seeing a lot of is more desire to build a data literate workforce and culture. But I totally agree. I guess the more you start to adopt data and analytics and even literacy, the more you realize you don't know. So I guess that's probably one of the drivers, is organizations might rate themselves higher initially, and then as they adopt it, they realize actually we're not quite where we thought we were.
Yes, which is a hard thing to admit to, but actually a very important step to take. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me go back to the start of the next section. So yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind what the business impacts are that you want to drive out from becoming data literate, because it's not necessarily as with investing in data itself, it's not an end in its own right. No one builds a data asset or data office just because they feel they should. It's always because it's there to drive and support innovation, new processes, responses to the changing market conditions or customer behavior. And it can be a little easier to map some of the negatives, I have to admit, than to show all the positives. But let's just take a look at some of these. So this is a report that PwC put out a couple of years ago. And I think this is very important external pressure that organizations are responding to, which is that shareholders, investors, the city more broadly, is asking more questions about the role of data and about whether, analytics, advanced analytics, AI, of course, now are being applied by an organization. And then that gets reflected in the shareholder value, the share price, the ability to raise funds, all of those things that at the C-level, they have to consider. And so it did a review of annual reports to try and assess the extent to which companies are now doing that. And you can see here, referring to data 48 times on average. Of course, some were way ahead of that and others behind it. But you wouldn't have seen that even 5 years ago, I think, that level of use of data as part of how the business is driving towards its strategic goals. Now, interestingly, you can see in that little graphic at the bottom, the rise in the defensive play. Now, this probably slightly reflects the global nature of the research that PwC did. In the US especially, we do see data offices working more on the governance and compliance piece. A lot of regulation that applies there, and the CDO role gets drawn into, compared to the innovation piece, where value tends to get created as opposed to mitigating risk and not having to offset the problem of being fined for a transgression. So an important thing to note, I think, there, but the positive takeout is that listed companies, any business that has to issue an annual report, is now talking openly about its use of data. And trust me, when I started writing about data exclusively back in 2005, that was not the case. It was very, very difficult to get companies to admit they were actually working with data, let alone openly talking about it in their annual reports. So from there, and within that same report, that top line finding, and to the question that you asked and my response to it, that slight step back from the belief that the momentum was all going one way towards becoming data driven, there has been a bit of a softening of that. And I think, Tony, it absolutely reflects both realizing there are more challenges in achieving this than you often recognize at the start, but also a rapid pace of change in what it really means to be data driven. And we can talk about some of those in a little bit. But if you look at this middle bit about that struggle with the cultural challenges, I think that really reinforces the reason why data literacy and focusing on people skills and developing your individuals and your teams and that culture across the organization is where the difference can be made. And as Peter Drucker says, it may well be your strategy to become data-driven. You may well invest in all the right things, but if you're not transforming the culture and getting people to embrace it and moving towards that evidence-based decision-making and data-driven process creation, then it could all come not quite to nothing, but it might not deliver as much as you anticipate. Now, we also did some research that looked into the amount of time and effort that goes into working with data now across organizations. And at headline level, so just over a third of organizational time is now spent working on data. And I think, again, Henry got excited by that finding. He's having a quick bark at it, apologies. But I think it's notable, the extent to which almost all functions in an organization now have data at their heart, and therefore the importance of developing essential data skills within your business, that a third of working time on average is spent. That second statistic is also important because 1/4 of all that time is productive. And if 1/4 is productive, that means you have unproductive time. And this is what our research showed us, that 10.1% of all the time that an organization spends on doing anything whatsoever is spent being unproductive trying to do things with data, right? That is a lot. That is that is a lot of effort. That is a lot of time that's being consumed, failing to get things done or doing things that really don't generate any value or direct output from your engagement with data. And when we put that into sort of a commercial dimension, 8.5% of annual revenue being lost because of that skills gap. So in other words, you can create the data assets, you can embed the technology, you can say, right, this is the strategy we're pursuing and data is going to support it. If you don't at the same time upskill your teams and make sure that they are able to do the tasks that you require of them now using those data tools, then there is a cost. There's a cost through wastage, there's a cost through lost opportunity. And in addition to that, you actually don't get things done at the pace that you might want to. And there's a spread to this. Of course, all averages are just looking at the middle point. But you can see there that, in some organizations where they're perhaps lagging behind down here at the foot, the cost, the skills gap to them, the more dependent you are on data, the less you've upskilled your teams, the more it is going to cost you, and therefore the lag is going to become more significant. And Tony, I guess you have to make the business case for people investing in skills. This is going to be part of it, isn't it? That you want your people to be productive when they're touching data.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really fascinating seeing what you're presenting there, because there's a few things I was thinking about. One is both when you're talking about the time investment to get someone more data literate, there's obviously a cost, both perhaps in the training, but also the time they have to commit. But at least what we've seen is the improvements in productivity can be so significant, but there has to be enough of an investment for it to pay off. And I think this also rings true to the organization. And I think what you were talking about before, I did read another Harvard Business Review article that mentioned, I think, in the companies that are successful at adopting data, 50% of the cost and resource and the budget was actually on cultural change adoption rather than the technology. And unless you go far enough, as you say, it could just all be wasted. So you've got to have that commitment to actually push through, because there will be bumps in the road, and it is a cultural change, which is always difficult. But getting there and getting over that hill, so to speak, and being able to then work off the benefits can be massive.
Yeah, it's a really interesting finding, isn't it? Just the extent of investment required in cultural change. And it's not a natural skill set for people working data. That's not why they start their careers in data. They do it for the love of the numbers or the tooling or whatever it might be that really draws them towards it. But of course, as they elevate up through a business, they are going to be asked more and more to do the people aspects of it. And that can be difficult. And we see that a lot. That can be where the struggle really begins. I have got a chart a little bit later that looks at where that focus of that resourcing is going within data literate organizations. I wonder if, Tony, is it worth just drawing out the points about apprenticeships and how they're funded? Because there may be people who are on this webinar who may or may not be aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was interesting because I remember a Gartner report coming out a few years back, and it was highlighting the key concerns of a chief data officer. And I think some of the top 3 or 4 were cultural change, adoption of the right skills, and budget for training. And I think you mentioned apprenticeships. I think they can be perfect for that, because they're funded by the government or the apprenticeship levy, so budget's less of a challenge. they do transform, somebody in terms of skills, because there's significant development. It's not just, hey, go watch some videos and now you're data literate. You actually have to apply it. So actually, a program like that can be really impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is also notable. We've seen an increasing number of examples where it's not just junior people who are sent on data and analytics apprenticeships. It can sometimes seem, it's that alternative path if you don't necessarily want to go to university. You take an apprenticeship historically, but I've recently encountered a number of individuals who were, let's say, mid-career doing other things, who've chosen to go on an apprenticeship scheme, which is data oriented, because they want to move into this space.
Yeah, I think it's particularly in this era where roles and work is being digitized. A lot of organizations are having to shift the balance of work and move into more digital roles. And actually, it's a great solution for reskilling, out of roles that maybe aren't so relevant, or actually there's a need to actually bring in skills that are more relevant. So yeah, it can be really impactful, both for upskilling and getting people through an existing career in data, but also taking people from one that wasn't in it.
Yeah, a guest appearance by Tony's cat. He did warn, like my dog, that we might be seeing or hearing from our pets. And yes, I think it's also important that there will be cohorts who started their careers when some of this was not available, when the skills weren't in demand, and feel anxious, and therefore offering the opportunity for that reskilling and that upskilling can be very, very important for retention and just employee satisfaction.
Absolutely, yeah. There's so much opportunity there, particularly also when you consider, I guess, the skills gaps in that area within the data area. A, it's a really great way to solve that, but B, it's often quite hard to keep hold of good talent. So continuing to invest in them and their development is a really great tool to help retention.
Yeah, and yeah, really interesting comments, Cecile. Thank you very much for putting that into the chat. I just mentioned that her hurdle is the organization sees analytics as something specialists do, not something for general staff. And of course, when we talk about that term of democratization of data, it's precisely about trying to move some of that analytical load into where it can be most effectively done, which is by the people with the domain knowledge of the business, who can then ask those questions using tools that have all the guardrails put around them, and where the individual has been trained to use them effectively and ask the right set of questions. So it is a challenge, Cecile, not to view it as a specialist ivory towered thing, and that's part of that sort of maturity curve and data literacy improvement that we see. Once businesses get, everyone should be able to do some of this, because it will improve what they do for the business. So let's push on and just take a look at how some organizations have done this. Oh, sorry, that was my other headline. So if you really drill into this, this is what you discover. So 1 in every 11 minutes of work is wasted by not having the right skills to do things productively with data. And the cost of that is 1 in every 12 pounds of revenue being lost. So there is a genuine business case to be made for this upskilling. And how some organizations done this in practice, I just want to play out a couple of examples that I've encountered. First of them, JLL, which is Jones Lang LaSalle. They're a global property services business. They run a lot of the buildings that many of us actually work in. You don't necessarily notice that they are the people responsible. And a couple of years back, they decided they wanted to pursue this vision of data. And if you look at that little suite of graphics across the bottom, it might be a little bit small for some people to read the writing, but going from right to left, they wanted to unite the community. And that was important because at that point they had over 130 users. This started in their business intelligence domain, who were working across 6 countries and 9 time zones, right? So they had all this pockets of expertise, but they didn't necessarily have that sense of a community of practice. They wanted to ensure they were allowing and supporting people on that continuous learning journey. And they brought to bear on that design thinking, change management, and also sort of a popular culture. And that gamification was a really interesting aspect to what they did. It's making it appealing to people to develop those skills and to show that they use these new suite of tools. Happen to be those two that I put on screen. Other tools are available. We're agnostic about which ones work for your own particular organization. But by making some of this stuff visible, giving people points, and points mean prizes, and having leaderboards and those kind of fun things, that's often a useful way to start to embed this culture change and make people feel, yeah, I am part of a community. I can get some bragging rights by showing I've done this. And at the same time, I'm advancing my career. I'm engaging more with other people across the business in different time zones, different countries, and it all starts to cohere into a view of data literacy. And actually, apologies, the year is wrong on this. It was 2021 that JLL won our Becoming Data Literate Award because of the work that they'd done. Just a second example here, a slightly different space actually, a very interesting one at Admiral Group in their data protection and privacy department. And again, some small writing right down here at the foot, where they realize, for the growth strategy that Admiral Group had, a really fundamental part of that was building that trust in data and demonstrating that all the privacy work, all the data protection piece was in place, and that this department would be able to support innovation, build that trust, and champion the fair and ethical processing of personal data. That was the mission statement that they set out to support the organization's mission statement of striving for better together, which is a really lovely way of expressing this. And they approach this through skills development, and they've seen off the back of that a lot of recruitment internally. People have wanted to come and work in this department because of the visibility that it's gained and the opportunities that have opened up. That's also enhanced its diversity. It's kept people in play in the organization and the department. They did this through an academy and self-learning, and some very specific to the domain of data protection qualifications that were offered there that support the progression in that space. And they've created a 95% trust index internally for this function. When other people across the organization at Admiral Group are asked about who they trust in the business, 95% say data protection and privacy department, and that's put them in the #1 spot. And again, Tony, thinking about taking forward a program at scale, I guess, to what you were saying earlier, that level of investment into culture change, it's important to not just put a few things in place, but to try to allow both everyone and across quite a broad domain to have something that they can do.
Yeah, absolutely, David. I think there's so much wrapped up in it, as those credos that you mentioned at the start. You can put all the tools in place, but that's not going to change. You can train everybody, but if you don't have the right data, if you don't have access to it, if the quality is not there, if the support from leadership isn't there, you need all of those pieces to fall into place. And that's why it becomes such a big challenge, because I think typically you have some highly motivated individuals who want to make stuff happen, but one or more of those key success factors just isn't there. So yeah, I think ultimately, once you've got an organization that's supporting and on board with trying to do this, then having a tool like an apprenticeship can be really effective to drive that change, and obviously save a lot of money when it comes to the training costs, but actually have enough of a commitment and enough resource sort of pushed into somebody or into a workforce to actually transform how they work. So yeah, I think there needs to be a huge commitment. You need to have a lot of staying power to get through it and get to the other side, and not be put off by the barriers that and the walls you might be banging your head against as well.
Yeah, and I think just expanding on that, we all know that there's this tremendous war on talent right now. It is difficult to get all of the resource, the human resource that you want and that you need, whatever organization you are in. Oh, has my camera gone off? Oh, it's back. Having a focused and structured training program really demonstrates a commitment to investing in individuals and their career development and taking them forward. So I think it's very important to look not just at one-off pieces of work that could be done, but at larger scale activities. And I've got a chart I'd like to show you all, which is drawn from the responses to this year's DataIQ 100 on the brand side, where we asked everybody a question about what they're doing to develop the data literacy in their organization. And I crunched down all of their comments and looked at the frequency with which these different areas of activity were coming up. Tony, this is genuine data that was generated before I knew I was going to be talking with you on this webinar, but I'm sure you're delighted to see that the number one mention was for apprenticeships, and that's fantastic. And again, I do think that's showing some progression in the maturity, and the fact that that's happening. Number two, mentioned within a data academy concept. So one of the things we see, and we'll come and chat about this in a moment, in a particular example that's coming up, is put in place the training program, but also make sure you're giving it a context. Make sure that right across the organization there is a sense that it's part of that forward momentum, it's part of that drive to become a data-driven business, that data literacy is a wrapper around it. So just running down some of these things. So data literacy programs as a standalone, running behind looking at Data Academy. I would say that you probably put a Data Academy first, and then you might think about, well, actually, how do we broaden that and push that out further into the organization? A guild is quite an advanced thing to have, and it's a little bit more focused on the teams, on the individuals who are doing the data producers, the data experts that you might have. And some of these, I think, are really go to that gamification, that sense of community, the lunch and learns, the community of practice. They're very important. But if you really want to embed this, writing it into competency frameworks right here, not a lot of people are doing that, but starting to spell out, in order to progress in your business, there are certain things you need to be competent at, and to gain a certain role or a certain level, again, going to salary and recognition, you might have to write data skills into that competency framework. So let's just look at one more example. I know, Tony, you and Cambridge Spark are very familiar with this one. This is at Marks and Spencer and their Beam Academy. And again, some small writing down here in the right-hand side, but I'll just read it out for you, because their strategic pillars here are to grow data literacy, to reinvent how they work, and to accelerate adoption. So they're very clearly spelling out that there is a connection between all of these things. And if you address them in tandem, you can hope to see that progression and that improvement. And a number of things, that they did there, where they used to have just one data apprenticeship, and we'll talk to Tony about that in a minute, to building it out into an enterprise-wide data academy. I think they've trained well over 5,000 colleagues. They're trying to make sure that every single colleague in M&S has the opportunity to be upskilled in data and digital. They have a new suite of tools that they've deployed. Their employee net promoter score has risen significantly, 85. Anyone who does that kind of employee satisfaction will tell you that is a pretty impressive score to achieve, and that's why they won Best Data Academy Award last year. And Tony, I mentioned you're involved with this one, right?
That's right. Yeah, no, we launched the world's first retail AI Academy with M&S, which forms part of their data academy. And I have to say, working with their Beam Academy team has been amazing. I'd definitely say that award is well deserved, because they're very much best in class in terms of how they're driving adoption. But I think going back to the previous slide about those various elements, I think it summarizes it really nicely, because these are all different elements that have to make up part of a solution for driving literacy. Apprenticeships are, as we've mentioned, a great part of it, but often we find we're delivering a solution which apprenticeships will be part of a data academy, because there will be separate online self-serve training, and there might be other courses that also incorporate into that. There has to be a team, and you see data literacy manager in there. There has to be a team driving this adoption, and all the efforts that go behind it, because it's no small feat to change the culture of an organization. So yeah, I think it just goes to show that you have to have a holistic approach to driving data literacy, and there's lots of different parts that can play a role in that.
Yeah, absolutely right. And one of the things I think we're starting to see now is typically data academies and data literacy programs do get initiated from within the data office, often by a CDO. But where they really start to lift off is when other functions and other leaders of those functions embrace it and say, right, I want to be part of this. How do we bring that into my area of the business? How do I ensure that our specific skills needs are also being met? And I suspect that from what I read about M&S, that's the stage they're at now, where the whole business is talking about this and engaging with it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting to see that, particularly in those organizations that are more forward thinking or further along on their data literacy or data journey, that the CDO or the CDO's office is just one part of it, and fine, it might be the brainchild of it. Ultimately, every leader has to drive these skills and these capabilities in their departments. And I think one thing we do a lot of is helping to try and showcase the potential benefits of adoption of data and data literacy. And I think as Cecile sort of mentioned earlier, it's a big challenge trying to change the view that actually data and data literacy is someone else's problem. It's not for me to do. I could pass off that problem, and that often means that essential data teams are actually completely snowed under with simpler requests when they could be working on more advanced or strategic projects. So
yeah, I think that's a really critical point, isn't it? That as you go up that adoption curve, the load on the data teams and the analysts increases and gets beyond what they can possibly support, which is why you have to then start looking at either automation or self-serve for some of those levels of reporting or simpler analytics that could very easily be done if you give people the right level of training.
Absolutely. I think that's what it's all about, is if once you've got a system and the right tools in place and you've sorted the data, then you're in a place to roll it out. But then it's very much about building those relevant skills and giving people the confidence how to use it. And I guess that's the challenge. And it's not only the challenge, how do we give the skills to people? It's how do we get them interested in wanting to learn those skills? And I think that's been a big challenge, and particularly with data literacy, we tend to find that when we work with organizations and we're offering upskilling, the sort of more advanced programs like data science and AI, or even our data analytics programs, they get lots of interest. But the one you find the hardest to get interest, or a sort of organic interest, is actually the sort of earlier stages with data literacy, because you tend to find that anybody who's already into data sees the benefits and wants to go further, but it's bridging that or crossing that barrier from data agnostic or low data literacy to a bit, and then once you've got that, you sort of catch the bug and you see the value of it. So it's really a case of trying to help people see that.
Yeah, I think that plays into a broader sort of cultural context where things like data can be scary to people. The concepts can feel a bit frightening. And, as has been in the headlines just this week about numeracy, and there are people, who are afraid of the concept of numeracy and getting too far into numbers, and that might be what it means to them. If they're suddenly being offered data upskilling, does that mean I have to, work spreadsheets and things like that? Now, a lot of that's just about communication, rather than about the actual skill set that are going to be trained in, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's partly a branding problem, I guess. In some ways, it's data shouldn't be scary, and I tend to like to use examples that if you were picking a restaurant for a birthday or something, you're going to be doing a data analysis, and you'll be using all sorts of data because you're looking at reviews, pictures,
Good
star
example.
ratings, locations. So I think people get put off by the word data, and as you say, associate it with numeracy, maths, technical. It's not for me, but actually we're all using data all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Just remind everyone, we are really happy to take questions if there's anything you want to ask, either about my presentation or about Tony and what Cambridge Spark are up to. Tony, one thing you mentioned there in connection to M&S, and it's very current now, you touched on AI. There's an important dimension around data literacy where typically new shiny toys suddenly appear, and often from the top down, it's like, right, what's our ChatGPT play? There's a tricky balance, isn't there, between saying, of course, we can do something. Oh, by the way, can we do some of this foundational work on our skills at the same time?
Yeah, ChatGPT is a really interesting one, and I know a lot of our clients are sort of having to backfill quite quickly in terms of policy and data governance because of the. I mean, it's a fascinating tool, and it's exciting to think about what it can do, and even to having tried it myself and some of my team, seeing how it can work. But there's so many question marks and things that come up with it. But I guess I think when it comes to data literacy, it's about starting with the simple things, getting a good feel for that. You're talking about critical thinking as a key skill. I mean, ultimately, you don't have to be talking too much about AI and technical tools at that stage, but just being able to use information to make better decisions and not get carried away too much with what's happening at the bleeding edge. I think it's good to have an understanding, but don't get too overwhelmed by the scary world of AI, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of really interesting questions come in via the chat. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Isabel, for those, particularly in the healthcare domain. Yeah, Rob, I mean, we all know healthcare workers are very, very busy. And how do you get them engaged in some upskilling around data, or just adopting the data tools? I think it's the same challenge in almost any function. Why should I spend my precious time learning a new way of working? You have to find the pain points, right? You have to find, well, if you can just carve out a little bit of time to improve your skill and use this new approach, the future time saving will be significant. It's that return on time. And I've seen this historically, right from the early days of CRM and Salesforce management tools, saying, right, give us an hour now, you're going to save 6 hours out of every week going forward. Eventually, of course, that win just becomes business as usual. But it is very much about scoping out something that people are doing where there's a manual process, or they're having to reconcile pieces of information that might be patient data or prescription data in some form that they're currently spending a lot of time on trying to manage. And of course, Isabel, to your point, we've seen the NHS making huge strides in analytics to the point where 2 years ago, number one in the 100 was the NHS's first ever Chief Data and Analytics Officer. They are embracing that and getting a lot of very significant use cases. But what have you come back with? They're too busy. Yeah. but not providing the tools. Yeah, I mean, that's a problem. I mean, NHS is investing heavily into analytics tools, works closely with faculty and the like. And fun enough, to that AI conversation, that's going to be one of the first places where OpenAI, the people behind ChatGPT, is working with faculty and the NHS to work out how it could be deployed there. So you have this sort of granularity challenge for the individuals, how to make sure they've got the tool and the time to learn how to use it and get better, versus the big strategic view of let's jump ahead as quickly as possible. Tony, do you get involved in, say, piloting projects and creating, therefore, a group of advocates and internal examples so that everyone gets a little bit of that fear of missing out and, oh, I better make some progress now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just looking at what Isabel's saying, I mean, it's such a common challenge time, but I guess it's that it's all about, as you say, David, building that business case to say, look, invest a little bit of time now and actually you get bigger returns later. I would also say it's also important not to try and bite off more than you can chew. Start small, pilot something, demonstrate some impact, and off the back of that, it's usually a lot easier to make a business case that, look, we should take this further. But yeah, we to answer your question, David, we do a lot of that. That's a lot of how we try and support the clients that we work with, is, you know, showcasing like the case study Abby's just shared from the NHS, showcasing the impact and the benefits that some of these skills can have, trying to, I guess, demystify some of the elements around data and make it more accessible, less scary, and break it down a bit, because I think a lot of it is about winning hearts and minds and just showing there's some exciting things that can come from this, and there's no reason why you shouldn't be part of it.
Yeah, and to the point that Isabel added there about still being Excel based, look, we'd love it, right? Nothing against Excel, it's a very useful tool, but a lot of people spend a lot of their time working on their spreadsheets and updating their macros and, you know, manually entering data, and that can be one of those pain points that can get identified. You know, the modern generations of tools that are better at the collaborative space. So it's rare these days for one person to have both all of the skills and all of the data to make all of the decisions, right? Using Excel, even a shared spreadsheet, is not always the best way for that to happen. And if you can start to show that there is a way forward, if people just get a little bit of skilling and a little bit of tooling to support that, it can be quite transformative, because instead of being stuck in the assembling, you know, the unproductive piece, back to that research I showed you, a lot of that wasted time is, where is the data I need? How do I assemble it, standardize it, normalize it before I can get on and do some analytics and then, you know, communicate those insights, which is, you know, where the value creation piece happens. So it's about looking around for a use case, finding where that collaboration needs to happen, and then planning in, what can we do? Can we land one of these pilots? Can we get Cambridge Spark in to train up some people to get really good at this, and then take that as a, you know, on the roadshow around the rest of the organization, say, hey, they did it. They were scared. They were worried about this. They thought, you know, they wouldn't have time for it. Now look, they're absolutely flying, and, you know, smiling faces. Because that's what happens, right, Tony? That's what we look for.
Yeah, it does. I think, yeah, I go back to the apprenticeship, but I guess one of the great things about the apprenticeship is there is work-based application. So you're learning the skills, you're supported by mentors who'll help you deliver work-based projects which can evidence ROI. So it's really a great way to actually start building up those use cases and examples of how these skills can be applied, what's the benefit. And again, it's all going to have to go up to leadership to say, look, there's benefits here by doing this. We're facing these challenges. If we sort this and we do this, this is what we could achieve. If you can build up that with, you know, small use cases and examples, then you'll probably have a pretty powerful business case over time.
Yeah, and this is where I think those early stage things, looking at the graph on screen, really have a role to play. You know, just those simple things like the lunch and learns, just sometimes bring in an outside perspective a guest speaker or someone to talk about what is happening, whether it's in your sector or elsewhere, because data is very horizontal, both within organizations and across sectors. Everyone is pursuing relatively similar goals, but with just the flavor of their own. Just starting to show the art of the possible can stimulate a lot of interest and a lot of appetite, saying, well, what would I have to do to have a bit of that in my department, in my function, or across our business as a whole?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing I would try and look for in your organization is maybe other departments or teams who've actually taken that leap forward and already have some evidence. So, try and make that leap yourself. But if there's other examples within your organization or even competitors or others in your sector, then it's a great way to sort of break down those fears or even, as you say, inspire that thinking about the art of the possible.
Yeah, we want those transformations to happen, don't we? We want people to realize, whilst it can seem scary at the start, the end point that you reach is your work gets better, it gets more productive, you get rewarded, you get promoted, all those great things. And we're seeing some connections being made via the chat right now, which is the other great thing actually about the data industry. And I guess, Tony, it happens across, I don't know if you run multi clients training or if it's always just with one client at a time.
No, I think that's one of the great things is a lot of our learners do join mixed cohorts.
Right.
We have a knowledge sharing forum, a peer learning forum as well on our Educate platform. So there's great ways for learners to connect, support each other, and I'm really pleased to see Rob, great
happening live,
to offer his support to Cecile, and to Isabel. So yeah, absolutely. There's lots of ways to learn, and I think it's great to look within your industry in your sector, but then there's so many inspiring stories and examples, such as your Mars rover example. These are the dangers of not getting it right. So I think that's been really enjoyable, David.
Yeah, I'm just going to come out of the sharing so that people can just see us instead. Hope that's off your screen now.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, David, I wanted to ask if you have any closing comments as we sort of come to time.
Yeah, sure. I think whilst it can seem like you've missed the boat with data, and especially around data literacy, it's absolutely not the case. One of the great things about embarking on any of these programs is you catch up rapidly, and with the advance of technology, sometimes you can leapfrog some of the pain that people have been through with generations of things they were trying to get to work. Now it all becomes a lot easier. But the only thing worse than not being data literate is not starting to be data literate, even if it's just at a really relatively simple level of putting some knowledge out there, starting to talk about the opportunities. Just get the conversation going, find out who's interested, see who puts their hands up, and you will discover pockets of experts, a desire to be part of a community of practice, a demand for skills training, and before you know it, you'll be running a data academy.
Wise words, and yeah, totally agree. Well, David, I can't thank you enough. Really enjoyed that conversation, found it really insightful, and thanks for sharing all of the intelligence and knowledge that you have. So, and thank you everybody for joining today. So as mentioned, Abby's dropped a couple of links to Cambridge Spark and also to DataIQ in the chat. Please do take a look. We'll also follow up by email with a bit more information, recording slides as well, so you can refer back to things. But yeah, thank you again, David. Really great.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. It's been great to talk to you, Tony and Cambridge Spark. Thank you very much for inviting me in.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.